Are you thinking of leaving corporate, but too afraid to make the move? Have you already escaped corporate, but are finding it hard to run your dream business? Are you wasting valuable time by attempting to figure challenges out on your own? We have created a podcast for corporate escapees running their own business. This is the Corporate Escapees Podcast by Build, Live, Give. We bring you first-hand experiences of guests going through many of the struggles you face each and every day as a corporate escapee. We get real with no corporate BS. And now, over to your host, Paul Higgins.
Welcome to the Corporate Escapees Podcast. And this is the experts section brought to you by Build, Live, Give. We get the best experts in the world to solve some of the core challenges faced by our corporate escapees. We have over 160 trusted suppliers, and you can find out more at blgboost.com. But today we have Dave Stokes from author to audio, and Dave is an absolute expert on transferring your book into brilliant audio, which I know is a medium that people are enjoying more and more these days. So welcome, Dave, to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Paul. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, look, great to have you on. And why don't we start with a bit of your backstory? How did you get to helping people take their books into audio?
Well, mate, I guess that's the main key. I mean, my byline with the business is that I record and produce audiobooks largely for self-published authors. So I think my target market is people who've been in business for a period of time, that they've had many decades of experience. So they're probably heading up to my tender age, sort of in their late 20s, or very late 20s, I probably should say. and I suppose in terms of what I'm noticing, or what I did notice actually, that there's been a resurgence, if you like, in business storytelling. There's been a lot more interest around voice in the last few years, and as this podcast we're doing now will attest, Paul, it's a really interesting way of accumulating information, gathering information. And the other bit of news too is the majority of us tend to be guys, perhaps a tiny bit younger than me, mate. So the target market for audio in general, for audiobooks and podcasting, seems to be around the 25 to 35 mark, and it's mainly gentlemen, because as it turns out, we're in the main, we're not particularly good readers. So we're happy to dedicate the time to learning stuff if we can listen to a story, but we're less likely than our female counterparts to actually pick up a book and read from a paperback. So that's been an interesting discovery. But I guess just to position it a little bit, but where I kept telling the story backwards, I was approached by a friend of mine, Kylie. I'd finished a contract at the ANZ. This is in September last year. And Kylie said, "Dave, what are you going to get up to next?" And I said, "Well, I'm not really sure. We'll just go get another contract, I suppose." And she said, "Well, how about audiobooks? I've been listening to Gary Vaynerchuk, a futurist on the subject of sound. And he's been saying, look, this might be a really fantastic growth area for you." And she said, "Look, you've got the IT background." So I spent 20, almost 30 years in software development, working for back in the 80s for computer companies, and then throughout the early part of the new millennium with JB Ware in stockbroking. So I've been around a little bit. And she said, "Also, you're a drummer, aren't you? I play drums and sing, and have done that since my early 20s. So I suppose it was kind of a combination of a lot of those skills just coalescing into one idea that seemed to combine most of them. And of course, it involves talking to people, and the sales and marketing side of it is something that I think I've grown into. I like to think I'm a little bit gregarious, so I've had a little bit of a leg up there. But boy, for anybody moving into marketing, you've got to take all of your ideas about how things work and basically turn them upside down. So I think in a nutshell, Paul, that's pretty much where I am today and why I'm here.
Great. And you said there's a real emergence of storytelling. Why do you think that's the case?
I think it's an interesting question, Paul. I think in my own experience in the work in the workplace, probably the best place to get information about a project that you're working on or trying to understand people, to get your message across, or either receive a message from someone or to get your own message across. That when we're talking, we've got a few additional tricks up our sleeve. So, for example, you don't have access to it when you're doing pure audio as we're doing now, because you don't get the body language. But of course, what we do get through audio when you're talking to someone, so in the situation where you're over the phone, for example, then you get intonation in people's voice. You can pause. You can start speaking faster so that as you're coming up to your point and you're about to give people the big killer, and then you stop and you pause and you slowly tell them what the point is. So I think it's the ability to communicate the message better, which describes perhaps why audio and storytelling have increased. And of course, it's more personable, and I think it's a more friendly medium for receiving information.
Yeah, and what percentage of authors now have an audio version of their book as well?
What percentage of authors? Now, that's an interesting question, Paul. Most of the statistics that I've been able to gather throughout the US and to a lesser extent through the UK, but there's actually no industry information being gathered in Australia at the moment. So it's all pretty much anecdotal. So to sort of almost answer the question, they figure that audiobook sales growth in the US is been pretty consistent for the past 4 years at about 35%, and it's been a tiny bit less than that in the UK. And the guessing game says that it's up around the somewhere between 15 and 20% within Australia. So we've got an idea of how the market is growing, but of course it's beginning off a relatively small base. So even though audiobooks have been around for, well, since I was a boy, so that they were originally, as the technology has changed, but prior to that they were coming out on cassette tape. So it's exactly the same concept. It's just that the technology has tended to revitalise the idea, and I think people are starting to enjoy the medium. So yeah, unfortunately, it sounds like I'm dodging that question, but it is quite difficult to come up with reliable statistics at the moment because nobody's gathering them. So we need Nielsen or someone like that on the job to start doing some polls.
Yeah, yes. And I said to you before we went live that so many times I'll hear an author on a podcast, and in particular John Lee Demas always mentions it on Entrepreneur on Fire as like,
Yes.
Have you got it in an audio book? And you hear that pregnant pause and it's like, no, I haven't quite got around to that. So, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges of turning, something that you're really proud of, a great book, into then an audio book?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I reckon that's a great question. As far as the kind of the kind of issues that will present for the author, I think the first thing is, well, perhaps just to give a brief insight. I've found, without wishing to go into there are two kinds of people in this world, kind of dichotomy, but what we have is that there have been two broad groups that the authors have fallen into. So most of my work has come through experts, as I mentioned before, people who've spent a lot of time in their industry and have got information to share and a desire to want to share that with others. So to share that knowledge for the benefit of other people. So I think there's something very altruistic in what's being done, but it also has a business purpose in addition or in parallel, and that is to use the book as a means of promoting their ideas, and that will eventually lead through to quite possibly some professional services income that may come off the back of the beginning of that relationship. So I guess that's one kind of group. The other group that I've had a couple of clients in have been the professional writers, so people who actually write books for a living. Now, the folks who write books for a living are focused, as you'd imagine, quite strongly on the number of books that they sell, whereas the professional services authors are probably less concerned about the book sales, but they're more concerned about the number of books that manage to be moved out there, so that so that your book becomes an idea of exposure, to sort of spread the word and spread the knowledge of you as a person and your business ideas. So they come from two quite different points in terms of their motivation. So the big challenge for the fiction authors, if you like, or the people who are writing novels, is that they just want to know what the break even point is. And for example, you might have to sell 2,500 books before you actually get to the break even with your audiobook. And if there's not that sense of confidence in that kind of in that kind of turnover, then it can be quite a difficult decision for a fiction author to take. And more often than not, as you perhaps imagine, novels tend to be a bit longer than some of the business books we read. Yes. So they're more typically up around the sort of 90 to 100,000 words, whereas the average business book I've seen so far has been around about 40,000. And so just to put a number on it, I mean, a 40,000 word book through my business will top to tail cost you about $3,000. Whereas a 100,000 word book, I mean, you're probably heading up to, quite sort of around about the $8,000 mark. So it's a more significant upfront investment. So those things I think come into play. The only other challenge really that I've found so far is where the author wants to read in their own voice, and certainly I always suggest that for people who are professionals and have a brand which is to a degree centered around who they are and what their voice is, because they've often spoken in public. People are used to their voice, given workshops, done podcasts, all sorts of things. So it's another reinforcement of your voice, if you like. And it can just be sometimes a bit hard to set aside half a day or a day to record your audiobook. So your 40,000 word book will take probably take between 5 and 6 hours out of your day. So you can do it within one day. But as you know yourself, Paul, sometimes it can be quite hard to block out an entire day out of your business. So sometimes that will perhaps lead to the authors, taking a bit more time about getting started on the book, or just literally being able to squeeze a space into their diary so that they can record.
Yeah, and look, I've heard it on a couple of podcasts, just the difficulty in actually speaking your own book. So, a lot of people saying it's easier to write, but it's a lot harder to get, and very tiring to.
It's a big day, yes. Absolutely, mate. Yes, I think I think it's always, in my own experience, I actually think I probably underestimated the amount of effort. But I suppose when you look at it, you sort of think, well, it's not really that. Think about it. It's going to be an audiobook that's going to, give from here to eternity. It's your, immortal voice recording. But it is, pretty much. Well, what was my most recent? My most recent author was a 50,000 word book, and it was about eight hours. So it was 8 hours in total, and that included an hour off for lunch. But we were breaking every. I suggest authors break every hour during the recording for about 10 minutes, just so that your voice doesn't go stale and you're retaining. You need to, although it's quite an intimate kind of style when you're narrating, because you've got to remember that as on podcasts, you're right inside people's ear in their earpieces, so you can't be using your public speaking voice. You've got to be looking at something. A more intimate voice, so it's more that you're having a close conversation with a friend. You're looking at that kind of speaking style rather than trying to project your voice out into a large room. So yeah. Most authors really feel it by the end of the day, and they're glad that they've done it. But they're glad that it's over.
Yeah. And how much practice? How much work do you do with them, Dave, to break through that initial fear when they first arrive in the studio? Or I think, from memory, you might also go to them.
Yes, Paul. Thank you. That's exactly right. That's and certainly that's. I think that answers the first part of your question. Is that I don't personally feel that it's mandatory to do your audiobook recording in a studio, because a lot of the elements that you will find that are contained within a studio to get a good sound are actually available in most people's lounge room or dining room. So from that point of view, I think that hopefully what I'm finding, because I suppose I don't have anything to compare it to because I haven't done any studio recording so far in the 10 audiobooks that I've recorded. They've all been at the author's home, or one of them's been at an office space. All the rest of them have been at home. So I'm tending to think that there's a feeling of comfort there. They're familiar surroundings. There's nothing unfamiliar about what's around them, and with some very small modifications to the room, the sort of things that we were talking about before the podcast began, Paul. Just make sure you've got the air conditioners off. Make sure your phone's turned off. It's if you've got a dog that loves to run in and out of the dog door, then you might want to see if the neighbours can perhaps have the dog for the day, that sort of thing. So as long as it's a quiet space and you don't have any, you're not on a busy road in an apartment, that can be a bit of a challenge. But to the extent that there's minimal background noise, then as long as everybody's not rolling around on squeaky caster office chairs, then you've got a pretty good recording environment in your own home. And I think that perhaps does help what could otherwise be a more strenuous or alien environment, perhaps.
Yeah, great. And what are some of the other things that you do to help the day be successful?
Oh, sure. Thank you. That was the second part of your question. I'd forgotten that. Look, it's not an onerous process doing narration. Most authors, as indicated, I think have already done some public speaking, so they've got a degree of training already in voice control, in voice projection. What I do tend to find will work quite well at the beginning of a book recording session is that if the author's of a mind, unless they just want to get out of the blocks and start at 10 o'clock in the morning and off we go, if they're happy about the idea, then I find I get a much better quality recording if I actually conduct an interview with the author first. So it ends up serving as a warm up. Because what tends to happen with people is when you do your test recordings first thing in the morning, you hear these little voices speaking to you saying, and I'm sort of poking them a little bit, saying, no, that's not the way you normally speak, is it? You're pulling something back there. And what tends to happen almost exclusively with people is that they will first imagine what their voice would sound like, and they start out usually somewhere between 80 and 85% of the actual volume that most of the recording will be at. So the purpose of having the interview in the first place is it gets them relaxed, it gets them warmed up. Hopefully we've been able to crack a couple of jokes, so their voice is nice and warm and fluid. They've got plenty of water beside them and all that sort of stuff. So by the end of the 15-minute interview, then their voice is completely warmed up, and so we don't. That means that the volume of their voice is going to be much more consistent across the rest of the recording, which makes for a better recording and certainly makes the editor's job easier too.
Yeah, I'm sure. And as far as what they're reading, just take us through practically, how do they actually read the script?
Oh, okay. Most the book will be in ebook form, so it'll be on an iPad or sitting at the laptop's been another preference. And I'm not sure for those of you who I did a psychology degree many years ago, and one of the fascinating room setups that I saw was Sigmund Freud. So in his rooms in Vienna, when he was when he was counselling his clients, he would have them lay on a very, very sort of luxurious, salubrious couch, but he would actually sit behind their head so that the patient couldn't see him. And it's actually turned out that I've adopted something fairly similar. I'm not dragging around a couch to everyone's house, but I actually find that if whilst and I'm sorry, but the point that you don't know what you don't know is that I will stay with the author for the entirety of the recording. I feel that really helps because I'll be there taking notes along the way, so we'll be picking up any possible mispronunciations or whether there's an issue in terms of pronunciation, say, of a Polish researcher that you refer to. Not quite sure about how that should be pronounced. So place names and things like that. So I'm taking notes throughout the way. And what I've found is that it actually becomes quite exhausting and quite distracting if I'm sort of making eye contact with the author or within their visual range, because we all have that social tendency when somebody is looking over towards us we can feel them looking at us, and so we're tempted to look back and make eye contact, which of course then divides the poor author's attention between looking at my face versus looking at the iPad that they're reading the book from. So that's been an interesting arrangement. The solution to that is that we sort of sit at a 45-degree angle to each other, so not quite back to them, but just so that we're looking away from each other, but we're still in the same room. So it's quite a curious setup. I don't know if I've painted rather an odd picture there. It sounds a little bit almost as if one person's offended another, and they're sort of like turned away and shunned them a little bit. So it must look a bit odd from the outside in.
No. Look, I suppose ultimately, the fact that you're doing it in their house and you're doing everything to make it easy for the author, I think that's fantastic. And any other key tips you've got about selecting who is the right company to work with in recording your audiobook?
Yeah, like I guess the most important, in my opinion, the most important thing in any business dealing and when you're forming a relationship with people, I think probably not restricted to people, is that we all have that kind of instinct to try before you buy. Makes it sound a little bit cheap, but it is along that idea. It's that have some sort of activity which you can use to foster or give the know, like, and trust the best chance of getting off the ground or on the right foot. So to that extent, I think, and I always think to myself, if I put myself in the author's shoes, then if I was choosing someone to record my audiobook for them, then I would like to know what it's going to sound like in the end, without going through the 7-hour recording and the phone calls leading up to it and the arrangements and, when are you going to be down from Sydney? When can I catch you in Melbourne? Can we record in your motel room? So before going through all that investment of time and thought and effort, my thought is, well, I want to hear what the audiobook's going to sound like in the end. So, what can you do for me about that, Dave? And so that's something that's a big priority for me, is to offer that to authors. So that's a free service that I offer, where I will record a section of the book that the author chooses. Normally, I suggest the introduction, because the introduction can be a nice précis. It's a bit of a summary of what the book's all about, and if the author likes what they've heard, and even if they decide not to go ahead with the audiobook, then they've got a nice professionally recorded industry standard volume level nice warm recording of their own, of the introduction to their book, which then becomes quite potentially a tasty little piece of social media content that they can use to promote their existing paperback, or if they're on their way to publishing, they can use it to promote the forthcoming book. But obviously, hopefully, in my game, it's there to give people a bit of to breadcrumb the forthcoming audiobook.
Sure. And how does that practically work, Dave? Do you do it in their house in that situation, or you do it remotely? How does that work?
Usually I start remotely, Paul. So I bring my own recording equipment to the author's home as a rule. And that's, of course, one of the benefits of doing the test recording, is that I get to be able to gauge the quality. If the author has their own equipment, then just gauge the quality of that and see whether it'll come up to industry standard in terms of the recording and environment. And so the format that the introduction recording will normally take is that I will generally advise authors who, say, for instance, have no recording gear available, and they just want to try and get the optimum recording they can with what they've got, but really has no idea about the technology or have any to hand. Then my suggestion is always, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Apple, but my suggestion is that my little Apple iPhone, I just plug in the earpieces, and I'm sure most people know now that little volume control that sits on the cord of your Apple earpieces is actually a microphone. So you can experiment a little bit yourself by using an application on the iPhone called Voice Recorder, and then you can actually find out whether you've got to hold that microphone on the cord a little bit closer to your mouth or a little bit further away, or whether you can just take the earpieces out and just use it as a lapel, pop it on the lapel of your shirt, and then basically hit the record button on your voice memos. Do a couple of quick tests to make sure you're happy with the sound and the room's quiet at home, and then just record your introduction, and it can be emailed to me directly from your mobile phone, and then I'll have a listen to it, and we'll produce it, send it back with some commentary, and quite possibly record it again if I think it needs doing it. But in most cases, it'll give you probably 80% of what you actually need. And it'll certainly be acceptable quality to be used as a social media post. And then we can decide whether we go on to the next step.
Great. And I'm sure listening to this, people are thinking, wow, that sounds so simple, Dave. Like, just use your Apple headphones. I don't need an expensive mic to record something like this. So, what's the go there?
Yeah, it's a good point. Paul. I think there is, obvious skepticism, and it's something that I was skeptical about myself in the beginning before testing the equipment. So, I suppose it's also couching it within the context of what we're trying to do here, which is basically trying to get the best recording we can, the best idea of how the author's voice is going to sound. If there's anything obvious in the narration style or ability, which is going to be any kind of a deal breaker. So what we're looking at is something which is probably going to be 80% of the quality of your final audiobook. So it's kind of like the a screen test, if you like, without having to set up the studio and paint the landscapes. So that's my recommendation at this stage, and also I think the iPhones, and again it applies to Android too. I'm sure, but I just don't have as much experience. Is that you can use that same format to do some face-to-face video interviewing. That's what I found as well. I think the iPhone cameras are absolutely terrific. You can get a really great quality video. It still won't look like a professionally recorded video, but when you're interviewing someone and each of you got your camera trained on the other, then you can actually play with that final footage and cut from one person to the other. And generally speaking, the audio's quite good. And just a tip too, that it is important that you do use the earpieces and that you do use the microphone that's on the earpieces. You won't get the same quality recording if you just speak straight into your phone and use the phone speaker. Then you're getting a lot more background noise. So it's got what we call a catchment cone. So there's a much wider recording cone for the phone speaker than there is for the earpieces. They're a more directional microphone, otherwise known as a condenser mic. So there are differences there. So if you've got your earpieces, then I'd certainly suggest that's the best way to go.
And I've seen where some podcasters have like nearly a soundproof box that they put their head in to do their recordings. Do you need to go that far?
Well, I suppose it's not for me to really tell people what to do. From my personal experience, I believe I've spoken to a couple of authors who have actually got themselves underneath blankets. So they've recorded in their home in the bedroom, and they've got themselves geared up sort of at the foot of the bed, and they've made what, Paul, my kids at the age of probably 3 or 4, they were grabbing blankets and cushions from the lounge room and making little cubby houses. So that's always my visual image when I hear the kind of extent that people have gone to secure that environment. But I think what most people are unsure of is, and again, you don't know what you don't know. So if you're concerned that you really do want to record this yourself, and you're perhaps a bit uncertain about the environment that you're in, then just simply do some little test recordings in each of the rooms. And I think if we just follow some simple kind of instructions around the room. So just to give you an idea, or to give the listeners an idea, Paul, my ideal scenario is a carpeted floor in someone's home. So whichever room we're in, So it's usually that exists in people's lounge or dining room, and particularly a lounge dining room, because you'll tend to have a table. So you'll have the dining table where you can set up and make yourself comfortable so that you're in a comfortable reading position to do the narration. Ideally, that room has got not high ceilings, if possible, but if they are high ceilings combined with material drapes, so curtain coverings which are quite heavy, and typically your lounge room will have some kind of plush material furniture throughout the room, and all of those things work very, very well as a thing called a bass trap, but they also take a lot of the room noise or ring out of the room just by virtue of their very, very existence. So the stuff that can be often picked up by the microphone in from a Laminex floor or a tiled floor, or a room which is quite bare and doesn't have any soft furnishings in there, you'll notice that room noise is much, much greater. So that's something you can do very easily and cheaply just by running around the house with your earpieces in your iPhone and just recording the sound of the room, which probably can feel a bit odd actually, because you're just recording silence. But when you actually play it back, you realise that rooms aren't silent according to a microphone. So to wind back to the additional question, I think we're after you get a very, very dead sound. So if you're in a wardrobe, or you've locked yourself up in the car to do the recording, then the recording sound will be very, 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 very dead, which means it's a very, very soft sound that you're getting, but you're still going to struggle with a lot of the things that you will struggle with any recording, and that's to remove any unduly heavy breaths out of the recording and things like that. Those things don't disappear when you're buffeted with soundproofing material. So I think it's probably a step too far, Paul, to be honest. But I wouldn't discourage people from doing it if they've already done that experimentation and it really is the kind of vocal recording sound that they want, then absolutely. But I think particularly on a hot day in the car, I mean, you're probably only going to be able to record for sort of half an hour at a time before you're on the verge of expiring.
Correct. And what are some of the other common myths that you often come across when recording an audiobook?
Other common myths. Well, I guess to the extent that it's at least at one definition. I mean, audiobooks are kind of old being new again. So there is that element that not a lot of people have had exposure to them. This is kind of, to some degree, it's a new path for people. I think particularly the audience with the massive rise of podcasting and audiobooks kind of following that, but also one informing the other, with people listening to podcasts tend to, if they want to do a deeper dive into the information, then they will perhaps buy the author's audiobook, or they may have come from the audiobook and got interested about a specific section in terms of the author's experience, and they want to bring themselves up to date with what this author is up to at the moment. Then there's kind of this bi-directional movement, one to the other. But a part of me answers the question, Paul, by just saying that I don't know if we're quite far enough into it yet to answer that question. It's still a little bit fresh and new, and I think authors are right to sort of sit back a little bit and say, well, do I really need that audiobook at this stage? So it's hard to answer that question without wishing to sound churlish or sound like an advocate.
Mm-hmm. And what about, has there been times where you've recommended not to do an audiobook?
There was only one occasion with an author who was very, very conscious about their voice. Now, this was off the back, and I think this is part of the we think of our voice really as just a part of who we are. I mean, in some ways, it's no different to your legs and your arms and your eyes and your ears. But as it turns out, our voice is actually a rather large part of, I think, psychologically who we are. So a lot of how we sound to people has a lot to do with things like inspiration and the nature of your personality, how you feel with other people, how engaged you are in your world. So it is actually a rather large part of you. And on occasion, in this particular circumstance, this author who I was hoping to record had said, "Look, Dave, I'm not really sure whether I should record in my own voice." And I was speaking with her on the phone, and I said, "Why ever not? You've got a lovely speaking voice." And she referred to an occasion a number of years ago where she had been recording some, I think they were voiceovers. I can't quite remember what the actual circumstance was, but it could have been recording an interview or something like that. But she was actually asked to narrate, to actually read something out, I think perhaps from one of her previous books at one stage. And after half a minute of reading it out, the sound engineer in the studio just called out into the room and stopped her dead and said, "Look, you're not a narrator, are you? You know, you aren't a narrator, and you never will be one." That's kind of, yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, I suppose sometimes as a professional, you can be, maybe feel a little bit entitled about your right to make those sorts of remarks, and it's not nothing personal, it's just business. But that really left a bit of a dent on her personality and has made her very shy of doing her current audiobook. So hopefully you'll hear from this author. I won't say her name, but hopefully you'll hear from this author in the coming months, because as we've chatted through it, we've gone down exactly the same path, saying, well, I certainly can't imagine how that would be the case. So let's hear so her sample introduction is on the way, and we'll have a listen to that, and then she'll be able to actually hear her own voice back with quite, more than likely some more positive remarks about the nature of her voice. So that might just get over that little, turn that frown upside down, I think is the expression, isn't it?
Yeah, true. And Dave, are there situations though where people are better as a public speaker, i.e. not having to read exact words, versus where you're in an environment where you feel like you have to read word for word perfect?
That's a great question. One of my one of my early clients, Paul, has a weekly podcast and has written a book on business storytelling. So I think that's where the example plays right in. So you've got the person who is used to speaking on their feet, educating people how to speak on their feet, and that storytelling is a very inexact craft. We stammer, we repeat words, we stop, just as I did then. We'll hesitate. That's an absolutely natural part of storytelling, and in any podcast, the majority of people will do it exactly the same way. Then you contrast that against the audiobook recording process, where you are literally just reading straight out of a book. Now that can it's a little bit tiger in the cage, in particular for public speakers, because they are used to, as you're suggesting, I think, thinking on their feet, going with the flow, even responding to people within the room. So it's a very different environment from that point of view, and one has to be careful not to start sounding a little bit robotic. So at the start, there will be this sense of the authors generally start at the very beginning of the recording. And again, this is another reason to warm them up first before we actually dive into the book, is that there will be a kind of a rather robotic reading of the book at the beginning in the first couple of paragraphs. And then after a while, they get into the groove of the book and they start telling as if they're telling the story to another person, which is this kind of feel you want from narrative, rather than the sound of a newsreader, for want of a better comparison.
Yeah, and I've heard stories where someone's actually had a picture of their audience or their ideal client in front of them as if they're talking directly to that person, which helps them be more conversational, or not conversational is the wrong word, but I suppose instead of just preaching. Have you come across that yourself, or seen examples of that?
No, but what a clever idea. I think, as we were discussing earlier, Paul, that my preference is always where the author's comfortable is to be with them in the room on recording day. I just think it gives you become a one-man audience, and there is I think there's quite a palpable difference into the way someone reads So it's a big ask to ask someone to story tell into an empty room. So I think having another living, breathing individual in the room with you, I think makes all the difference. I mean, it ticks all of those intimacy, nearbyness, and you do have a conduit through which to tell the story. There is actually someone in the room listening to it, and the author will look over at me every now and again, and I'm busy scribbling down notes and thinking, wow, that's a great one. We'll have to remember at that point in the book to pull that out. That's a fantastic quote. So we can actually be picking out some of our promotional bits and pieces along the way. But I suppose, yes, in a situation where I've only had one author who's self-recorded and did an extremely good job. But I think there were some challenges associated with tiredness. I think particularly where if you run a little bit longer, and you've got to self-monitor too, of course. So if your voice is starting to sound a little bit tired or a little bit raspy, or you've left it a bit long before having a drink of water, and you start doing things on the recording, the sort of things that your audio guy will take out from this interview, Paul, things like, and if you can perhaps leave this one in, is that when your mouth gets dry, when you begin a sentence, you always click like that with your mouth because your lips are dry and they just smack open. So that's a big one. And the other thing too, I think, is occasionally there can be an overzealousness with particular points, which will mean you actually move yourself much closer to the microphone. As I'm not sure if it's making any difference me doing this now, but so if you're leaning right into the microphone, as we tend to do when we're making a point in conversation, you can often be tempted to lean right forward towards the person. So therefore, all of a sudden, the volume becomes much louder in the recording. And the opposite is also true, that occasionally when people are sort of winding down from a topic or just settling back into a narrative, they may actually lean right back in the chair and move further away from the microphone. So there's a few of those little bits and pieces, the acting side of it, if you like, that it's really handy to have someone in the room with you, just noticing those little things and perhaps saying, look, might be good. It sounds like your voice is getting a bit dry, or, maybe it's time for that 10-minute break now. Let's go a little bit early, get up and, shake your legs. It's like driving long distance, that sort of idea. It's always good to get out of the car and have a bit of a run up the road.
Yeah. And as far as your expertise, how do you constantly stay informed and build your expertise in this area?
Largely by experience, Paul. So as each author has come online and gone through to the publication process through to Audible and iTunes, it's really just taking stock of what went on in the last recording. Any way that I can improve things. I think it's I think it's fair to say it's reasonably easy to get a good recording with not a particularly expensive setup. So my recording equipment all fits into the boot of my car, and it will allow me to record two voices at once. So I can record out of two microphones at the same time, and it's been to be honest, I'll probably sound a bit cheap here, but it's been about a $1,500 investment. So what I have in the boot of my car, Paul, is really just a mixing desk, which I think is a very important feature, which not everyone knows the value of. And as long as you have a decent microphone, and I notice your Rode podcasting mic, they're a very good device. But one of the downsides of the Rode of the podcasting mic format is that they tend to have more of a field recording cone, which means they're designed to some degree to be in the middle of a table, and you might have 4 or 5 people around the table talking in collaboration. So the microphone is designed with a relatively wide recording cone, so that each person sitting around that table will be picked up at a relatively even volume. However, my preference, and again, they still work, but you have to pay a bit more attention to your environment with a Rode. Soundproofing becomes more important because the microphone's more sensitive. Whereas on my equipment, I choose it's called a Shure microphone, so SHURE, and they're very well known as the kind of go-to vocal microphone in the music industry. So when you're playing live, you'll find that most of the sound engineers that come along to mix for you for the day, they'll have 5 or 6 Shure microphones. So they're the go-to recording mic. And what's distinctive about the Shure mics is that they have a rather narrow recording cone. So if the microphone is quite close to your mouth, and I don't suggest people talk directly into microphones either. Otherwise, if you're doing your P's and your D's, and those strong consonants will tend to come out as pops because you're actually pushing air out of your mouth. And if you're talking straight into the microphone, then the poor old microphone diaphragm will cop the full brunt of that force, and that will leave a big imprint on the recording. So if you can keep the mic about 45 degrees to your mouth and just to the side of your mouth, that'd be one of my recording tips. But yes, just moving back to the Shure microphone, they're about $150 each, and they're absolutely wonderful. They're incredibly reliable, and because they have such a narrow recording code, they don't record much of the ambient noise in the room around you. So you don't need to go quite so hard with your soundproofing environment.
Great. And as far as a like a wind sock over the top of the mic, does that make any difference?
It does. That's another go-to, Paul. I notice you have one, and that will also soften those consonants we're talking about. I think what do they call? Oh, yes, and there's the consonant sound, so that the P's, the D's, and the B's, where you're pushing air out of your mouth. The windsock helps to reduce the effect of that. So if you combine that with speaking to the side of the microphone as well, then it sounds much more like your natural speaking voice. The other thing I tend to use too, Paul, is a little device called a pop filter. And what a pop filter? They're funny looking things. They're kind of on this bendy kind of universal pole. You actually screw them onto your microphone boom, and then at the end of them, they look like a little mini squash racket. So it's a round shaped flat surface, which is a metal grid that looks a bit thicker than flywire. Now that device goes between your mouth and the windsock you're talking about. So you've got the mic underneath. You've got the soft foam windsock across the top of the microphone, and then between your mouth and the windsock is this little device called a pop filter. And they don't look like much, but they do make a difference. They just give you probably that extra 15% softening of your voice, and just make the force of your recording voice just that little more consistent.
Fantastic. Well, I'm a bit nervous to talk now, Dave. You've given us lots of great tips. And what's some parting advice you'd love to leave the corporate escapees audience?
Oh yeah, look, I think. Oh goodness me, I imagine, in my own mind anyway, Paul, there's great consistency with these observations, but boys, you have some shaky days every now and again. I mean, for me, it's just coming up for, where are we now? So we're July. So I'm about 10 months into my experience. Between September and Christmas, it was really just about trying to, develop systems and processes, and build a website, try and build the business idea and put it together so that I could communicate it with others, and that they would be somehow attracted to the idea. So your first 3 months, you're really not doing all that much. It wasn't until the new year when I managed to pick up a couple of clients, when things started really moving along, and giving me that opportunity to work in the business as opposed to working on the business. And but it's still tough from time to time. There are still times when you have gaps in your revenue, where you're just in a space where you're busting to send out an invoice. But I suppose some good advice that I received earlier in the piece, Paul, which I think is really helpful, is that not a bad idea if you're starting it on your own as the corporate escapee. If you can manage to set aside something like 6 to 12 months worth of income and have that in savings, then I think that it doesn't make the process easy, but it certainly gives you, it avoids you that discomfort that can come with things being, like really diabolically financially tight. So I'd say, of all the things that you can control, that would be my first one. You can at least eliminate that level of sort of, chronic or constant background stress that can come with financial difficulty, because you're going to have to spend a lot of time regardless, and you might as well make yourself as comfortable as you possibly can. So that'd be my advice. And apart from that, just, work as many hours as you can, and try and meet as many people in the industry. Meeting people like yourself, Paul, who already speak to a lot of people in business about the sort of subject matter that you might be interested in. It doesn't have to be specifically about your product or your service, but I think, as you're intimating as well, there's, regardless of the nature of the service we're providing, there's a lot of this experience about becoming a mature age business owner, for want of a better term, or that's at least part of the cohort. That it's great to share that experience with others, because occasionally, depending on how many people you're working with, just on your lonesome can be start to feel that way a little while. So it's great to be able to compare notes and exchange feelings. So that'd be my advice for people. Make sure you've got that little bit of backup income underneath you, anywhere from 6 to 12 months worth of income as savings, and that'll at least take that potentially stressful aspect out of it.
Brilliant, and really appreciate, Dave, your wisdom that you've shared on today, both from your expertise around audiobooks. It also went broader into recording of sound, which I think, as you said, stories are so important in today's world. So getting your story clear and getting an expert to help you with that, I think, is so important. Dave, I think, is a great example of that. And Dave's also offering for that free recording of your intro, which I think is a fantastic offer. So if you go to author to audio, and it's the number 2, so author2audio.com/contact, you can contact Dave, and he can give you more details on how you can record that free intro. And we'll also put that and also other links in the show notes that Dave's mentioned today. So once again, Dave, thanks for coming on. Thanks for being an expert, and thanks for being a supporter of the Build, Live, Give community.
It's an absolute pleasure, Paul. And yeah, mate, look, I love what you're doing.
Brilliant. And if you'd like to find out more experts like Dave, we've got about 160 of them now that have been vetted, and they're in our community. You can just go to blgboost.com and you can join. You can get access to experts like Dave, and also get direct coaching by myself in that community. So Dave, thanks again for being on the podcast, and look forward to working with you soon.
My great pleasure, Paul, and good luck with the manuscript.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dave.
Cheerio.
Thank you for listening to the Corporate Escapees podcast, brought to you by the team at Build, Live, Give. If you found this podcast helpful, please share it with other corporate escapees. If you would like to join a community of like-minded peers, please visit www.buildlivegive.com. Until next time, thanks for listening, and be brave.